The Knights of Ren podcast is brought to you by Cool Stuff Inc., your source for Star Wars Destiny singles, sealed product, and more. Check them out at coolstuffinc.com.
Show me again the power of the darkness.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll. D20radio.com.
It's true. All of it.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to the Knights of Ren podcast. This is episode 215, and with us this week are Rick and Jay. How are you guys doing?
Doing good.
Doing well.
All right, so as we have been talking about for many weeks now, we just had the Stele Open, and boy, there were a lot of people that showed up, and we've got the top 4 deck lists to talk about, and I mean, Worlds is right around the corner. We've got so many really big events coming up, so let's talk about the top 4 decks and just kind of like deconstruct and discuss like what these decks are supposed to do, why we think, they made it into the top 4, and, how people who are listening can pilot these, or if they have to, go against them, what they can do, to kind of try and beat out the decks. So first of all, the most interesting one I definitely want to talk about is Elite, General Veers, Night Sister, and Balatik. And I'm just going to go through these deck lists. We have 2 of them on point, and then the other 2 we're going to be getting later. But we've got your DH-17 Blaster Pistol, F-11D Rifle, Holdout Blaster, Hunker Down, Jetpacks, Promotion, Backup Muscle, Cannon Fodder, Deflect, Feel Your Anger, Flank, He Doesn't Like You, Intimidate, Probe, Tactical Mastery, Unpredictable. And we'll put links to these in the show notes and on our Facebook page. And then when we get the other 2 lists, we'll put those up. But what do you think about this deck? This is a little bit untraditional compared to what we've seen. Usually there's a Django in there. And this is running, 2 Veers instead of 2 Balatik. So what do you guys think about the deck?
So this deck was piloted by Mike Hill. He's one of the local guys in the Nova area. He won a local event with this a couple weeks back, and so I've known about this deck. He's made a couple of changes here. The deck list that he won with a while back had a lot of one-ofs in it, and essentially this is just a rainbow, a red, blue, yellow, good stuff villain deck. You take your very efficient dice from General Veers, Night Sister, and Bala, and then mix it with a bunch of ranged weapons out of, yellow and red, and then getting all of the good dice mitigation and events out of the 3 colors. So standard flanks, and He Doesn't Like Yous, and things like that out of what you would normally see, but then being able to add in Deflect, Feel Your Anger, and Intimidate from blue. So basically you just take your Veers dice that are going to roll damage, your Night Sisters that very likely roll damage, and if not, you can use her ability to reroll dice, pairing them with weapons that have a lot of modified sides on them, and just crank out the damage while removing your opponent's dice. So Rebel War Room is the battlefield. It's more there as a way to kind of speed up a little bit, being able to, as an action, resolving one of your dice, whether or not it has the resource cost, but if it does have a resource cost, you don't have to pay it. And plus, it doesn't hurt you too well if your opponent uses it as well on you. It's a very, very streamlined on what it wants to do. It wants to crank out damage and just kind of keep you off your game plan as best as possible.
So the first question I have for this deck is, why is Veers at 2 and Bala is at 1? Because traditionally we've seen the swing go the other direction, where you want to blow up the weakest character in your opponent's field, get Bala loaded up with stuff, untap him, and start doing tons of damage. Can you explain why he made that decision?
I kind of moved away from the Nova area before he took this deck out, but just looking at it, General Veers' dice it's one of the best dice for range damage out there. You got 3 damage sides on there, 2 of which are 2, one of them being a modified side. He's very likely to roll out the damage, and when we talked about like Veers Django, or Django Veers, however you want to talk about it, we always kind of overlooked Veers in the beginning from because he doesn't have a flashy ability like Django does, and you're you're actually not using his ability at all in this deck. But his consistent dice is what actually puts out the damage on the Django Veers deck, because he rolls out first, probably gets 1 or 2 range damage out there, and then Django gets to activate and get the other damage out. So he's just basically taking that very consistent damage and pairing it with the 3 colors that he can get out of here. And the best way to do that is with the Night Sister and Bala. Bala being 1 dice, he's more in there for the yellow and the fact that he's a range character. His ability when it goes off in this deck is good, but I don't think it's what he's pushing for.
Yeah, when you're swinging the decision between Veers and Bala, one of the things you have to remember is also factoring in how many 2-character lists you plan on seeing, because Bala struggles more against 2-character lists where they tend to have more health or more defensive options, or killing the weaker guy quickly doesn't always lead to the best results, depending on how the upgrades have fallen to the field. Going for the Tusken first usually, in my experience, isn't the way to beat Vader Raider. Not that I have the best track record in doing that, but usually if you can pop down Vader, you should have an easier time killing Tusken, but that's not always going to result in having Bala, kit out. So Veers definitely has the more reliable die. I mean, even if you factor in Bala's focus, it's much better as a support role, and relying too much on focus cannibalizes your dice over time, so you definitely want Veers firing on all cylinders. I do find it interesting this deck doesn't run Electroshock. I know a lot of people are on the fence with that card, because the moment Bala evaporates, that card, loses its utility. But again, the way the threat is spread amongst these characters, Bala isn't likely to be the first one to fall, so it has some more longevity. But again, reliability is a concern. I also just had to laugh because looking at this list and thinking of cannon fodder, I always think of stormtroopers and red targets for cannon fodder, and it's a red card, and I was like, who does this hit? Oh, right. So yeah, cannon fodder on Night Sister is also really clever, as she's probably also not, I don't know, they're gonna go for Veers. Veers has the damage and the power, and he's probably going to have the weapons too, and you're going to, hit fast, hit hard, hit strong. And so it's interesting. Deflect is probably better than Electroshock, so I can see that. This is a really interesting rainbow deck.
All right, so since this has obviously made it really well in the top 4, and people are already clamoring for the Stele Open deck lists, do you think we're going to see something, either this deck or something similar to this in Worlds? And what do you think is a good way to play against it? Because we haven't actually seen a majority of rainbow decks. Most decks are 2 colors, and this is very interesting. Like we talked about Veers being the target, but how do you deal with a deck like this?
I think you're absolutely going to see this in some amount, because this is the only, unknown deck that's popped out of the top 4 in the Stele Open. The Epo E-Ray deck, those are built kind of differently, so the next one we talk about may be a little bit different than what people have been seeing, but this one was not on anybody's radar, at least outside of the Nova group that I know of. But it's going to be there, and I think you're going to have to, like Jay said, you're going to have to go after Veers. I think the smart way to play this deck is to load up Bala, especially against a 3-character list. Have the Night Sister there for utility and helping out with the dice and taking your cannon fodders. Let them go after Veers and hopefully get a trigger or 2 off of Bala. Against a 2-character list, that may change a little bit, but you kind of want to make Veers not the biggest target on the board. So if you start loading him up, they're absolutely going to go after him. So your choices really are going to go between getting rid of Veers' consistent dice or Balatik's ability.
Now, with the way the deck is built, there's some very strong removal. On top of that, Night Sister always has her action where she can ping herself a damage and re-roll a die. Does this deck have the same strength that a control deck does in its suite of, rainbow colors? It's got access to everything.
Yeah, it's like I was saying when I was going through talking about the good stuff. It basically just takes every good control card and jams it in the deck. And like Jay said, the not including Electroshock is probably where your big difference is going against this deck in the future. Whether or not they're playing the electroshocks in there or not. Whether they take out the intimidates and put in on the hunts for more repeatable shield removal. But that keeps you kind of on your toes on who to get rid of, because, as he's not running electroshock, getting rid of Balatik when you think you're going to get rid of that option for him, it does nothing. And then it just leaves the tactical masteries, the only and the flex, the only 2 spot cards in the deck, still very well to be able to use, and then not really taking anything out from getting rid of Balatik.
It's interesting too, because the longer the Night Sister lasts, the more influence she has over the game using her ability. So there's some pseudo control that comes with that. Also, the deck does run Probe, which is a card I always like and always wish I could fit into more lists, and that will help you deal with cards that may mess up your plans, like good old Dodge, which is still seeming to turn up in lists. But overall, I mean, Rich summed it up perfectly. He was saying, like, it's got the good stuff. I mean, do you have it when you need it? Are you going to feel your anger and actually see miss sides or not? It all depends. And what's nice is a lot of these cards, like, Intimidate is a little bit disposable. Tactical Mastery gives you that ability to make, like, a really scary Veers play or a really scary, loaded up Bala play right when you need it. It's got backup muscle. It's got pretty much all the ways of getting in where it needs to. Again, it's just interesting. Like, I haven't seen a lot of rainbow lists lately, so I haven't had to deal with, like, air quotes, all good stuff all the time.
Yeah, going along with what Jay was saying there, that there seems to be an obvious choice between isolation and feel your anger here. In our testing, me and my group, one of the things, we were running a blue deck kind of similar to this, trying to judge if we wanted to run Feel Your Anger or the isolation. Feel Your Anger having a much higher upside and being easy to push an advantage, where isolation can kind of save you a little bit of damage here and there if what you're getting rid of is a character dice. So he seems to have taken the Feel Your Anger upside choice on here. Also, Feel Your Anger not having to spot a blue is very relevant when you only have the one blue character there that you're going to be dealing potentially a good amount of damage to with the cannon fodder and Night Sister's ability.
All right, and then the last question is, most definitely, if someone's looking at this and they want to pilot it, how difficult is this deck to pilot?
It's got a lot of lines of play. Obviously, Mike made it to the top 4 of an 80-plus person tournament. So skill, anytime you have large numbers like that, is going to play a part. Really, no deck can you take into a tournament and not know how to play it and be able to do well with it. This will probably take a little bit of tinkering with on, what events to use when do you probe, do you save the Intimidate if they're stacking up shields, or do you burn it now if you have the damage available for you? What dice are you getting rid of if he doesn't like you is the standard stuff. But mainly, I think it's going to be judging who your opponent feels is the bigger target and who you're going to start putting your upgrades on. So this deck is only running 10 weapon upgrades for extra dice in it. So you need that choice to be correct, especially when all your characters have such low health, all below 10. Veers being the beefiest, and he's usually not. So you don't want to, spend the money on the jetpack, put it on Veers when, your opponent's just going to burn Veers down on there. You do have redeploy in the F11D and the holdout blaster. But again, those are only, 4 out of the 10 weapons that you're going to have on here. One of those weapons being promotion, which doesn't add too much. It essentially has a blank on there, or 2 blanks on there with the +1 melee. But yeah, I think basically, when you're playing, if you want to take this deck to a large tournament, it's just knowing what lines to take when and who you want to load up with your equipments, who your opponent's going to prioritize taking out.
All right, so let's take a look at the next deck that was in the top 4. This might be a little bit more common. We've got E. Podamron, E. Ray. The cards in the upgrade slot are Comlink, DH-17 Blaster Pistol, Force Throw, Holdout Blaster, Lightsaber, Mind Probe, One with the Force, Ray Staff, and the event suite is Defensive Position, Deflect, Dug In, Field Medic, Force Misdirection, Hit and Run, and of course, it's a trap. So let's talk about this. What do you guys think about the deck?
I understand it, but it's still interesting to me that it's a traps in the deck when it's only Poe and maybe the DH-17 if you have it. Like, sure, if you can score it off of them rolling a special and then double trigger Poe special from 2 cards, it's like, again, completely made sense. It just stood out to me, like, in the moment. As far as, like, the specials that you can trigger, you know, you can get the Force Throw, you can get the Lightsaber special, the Mind Probe. One with the Force is obviously, can be super impactful and great. Yeah, this deck feels really tight in just that it's a lot on Poe and a little on Rey, which has always been like Rey's case in Awakenings. That's gonna change when things like Vibraknife hit play. A whole lot of defense, and not always in the ways that's going to keep you in the game. You know, sometimes Field Medic isn't enough. Dug in, there's ways of getting around it. Defensive position, you have to have claimed. And while this deck is not the slowest, it's in the middle, I would probably say. Force Misdirection, you know, great if it lands. It's similar to Feel Your Anger in some ways. It does have Comlink. It's one of those cards where it's great when it works, it's expensive when it doesn't. Obviously, overriding makes that a little bit null, but sometimes it makes the situation worse. Overall, this deck is very much a momentum deck. It wants rolls to go in your favor. It wants to kind of turtle and hope that through Rey shenanigans or a couple of choice upgrades that can stick around, you can hit hard enough. Try to keep that pull alive. Hopefully they play something with special sides. You know, if you look into playing against like Kylo, who just inherently has special sides, you can probably very quickly do some nasty things. But it is interesting to me because this does seem very feast or famine, meaning like it has a lot that needs to go well for you. Otherwise, it seems like it's very much in a backpedaling position.
Yeah, this tournament wasn't streamed, so we don't, have any insight on how these decks played out. I do know that this deck played against the other Rey deck, Han-Rey in this top 4. And just looking at the events, this player just really doesn't care too much about what your dice show up. He's not running anything other than Deflect and Force Misdirection as dice mitigation cards. He just wants to do his thing and hopefully spit out as much damage as he can before Poe is taken out. Talking about It's a Trap, there is a little bit of a combo in here. If, like Jay said, your opponent has a special, it's a trap to take Poe's special, being able to discard a force throw, a one with the force, using its 3 focus, and then focus your other like force throw, lightsabers, and mind probes that you might have out on the board to specials and deal a ridiculous amount of damage with those. But yeah, again, you're really not going to be using It's a Trap for anything but extra specials on Poe, or being able to get to the specials on Poe. A lot of defensive cards, like Jay was saying, so it's going to let you deal the damage and hopefully be able to shield it or medic it away before Poe is killed. Defensive position, I don't really count that as a consistent dice mitigation card, but this deck is relatively fast with Rey's ability and the hit and runs and things like that, so it may get a little bit of value out of it. Again, it's 2 higher, and you gotta have the battlefield, so I don't know if I would have chose that one, but there's not a whole lot of other options yet in red and blue. Might have taken a dodge here instead, but that's just me.
So I've actually played a bit against this quite a bit, and I used this deck myself in our local tournament this weekend, and there's a couple things that Poe and Rey do pretty well. It is a very feast or famine deck. If you get the right hand, you can do so much damage so quickly. If you don't, it's not impossible to dig yourself out of a bad hand, but that's one of the more interesting things I feel about Poe and Rey is your cards in hand really denote where you're going to be going. And you generally do get Emperor's Throne Room because Poe has 2-3 sides and Rey's numbers are high enough where you're generally rolling on average between 4 to 6. There's always the God rolls and the bad rolls, but traditionally you have a high enough threshold where you are going to be rolling Emperor's Throne Room over Han and Rey. But, Han and Rey both have the same spread of numbers, so it's kind of you'll see what you get, although Han does have 1 extra resource where Poe has the special. But the point is, the It's a Trap is there because I've used it and had it used against me many times, where you're rolling out Poe and Ray, and you've got Poe sitting on, who knows, maybe a couple blanks, or you've got a disrupt and a resource, and your opponent thinks that they're safe, and so they roll out something. And since range damage is so in the meta right now, it's very, very common to see range damage sides on the table. And I actually used this combo today to win the game. My opponent rolled out Ebola, he got nothing, and then he got re-rolled and got 1 range damage. So I ambushed It's a Trap, changed Poe to both of his 3-for-1 sides, and nuked his character before he could do anything. And It's a Trap is used for specials, but you can most definitely use it with Poe to turn him into 6 damage for 2 or 5 damage for 1. And especially like you roll Ray out with your holdout blaster to get that action economy. There have been turns where you turn all those sides out and you get 8 damage for 2 resources, and you get the kill because you're able to flip your dice and resolve them before your opponent can do any mitigation. So It's a Trap is very powerful in the deck. It obviously matters what you've got out, but even with just 2 Poe dice, getting 5-for-1 or 6-for-2 is a pretty heavy swing with that ambush action. And the deck overall is a really fun deck to play, and I do like what's in this suite. I haven't used Field Medic myself or Defensive Position, but I do understand that there are enough dice coming out, especially we just talked about Veers. Most of his die faces are 2. And if you get that really good Veers roll, it's like 2 and a +2. Defensive Position for 1 is not a joke to pay 1 resource to get rid of 2 or 4 damage at that point. Yes, you do need to have the battlefield, but the Poe deck is so fast. You're generally maybe taking 3 full turns because you're getting so much action spread from Ray that you maybe 4 at the worst. You're not really doing much. You're generally playing a card on Ray, rolling, and then you hope to get that hit and run off where you roll resolve, and then whatever's left on Ray or Poe, you either resolve it or you take the Emperor's Throne Room, flip into a special, and you've got something going with lightsabers, your force throws, things like that. It is susceptible to bad hands if you just cannot get things in your hand. That's how I lost one of my games today, is I had everything on the table I needed. Poe was on double special, Ray had a bunch of money to make, and my hand was full of events, and I just couldn't special throw anything into my opponent. Conveniently, he was so afraid of it, he used 2 electroshocks to eat those post specials, so I was able to use a bait, but the problem was, like, I sat on that for 2 turns, and it was just very, very frustrating. So there are ways to play the deck well, but the big thing is this is a bursty damage deck. I have seen this happen more than once, where you have double Mind Probe in your hand, you play Hit and Run, or you put Holdout Blaster on Ray, you get your 2 actions, you use Hit and Run, you roll out your Poe, you get 1 special or 2 specials, and then with your 2 actions you resolve double special for 10 damage to a guy, or you do 1 special for 5 damage, and then you claim the Emperor's Throne for 10 damage, and you flat out kill somebody. It is a very, very bursty deck, and you cannot take anything you see lightly. In removal, you gotta really know what is going to be happening, because you can look at a blank and think, oh, cool, nothing's going to happen. But with Emperor's Throne Room, there's a lot of ways to flip your dice that you're looking at into things you weren't expecting. So it's got a lot of filter, which is strong, but it does have some issues if you get those bad draws, or if you get hit with mill and they eat out the cards you were going to throw with Poe. That is very problematic. But it is a strong bursty deck where you can deal damage faster than your opponent can even fathom what just happened. So I understand why it's going to do well in some of these tournaments. One thing I can definitely say, especially playing against this, so I have a buddy Eric who I play with all the time, and he runs this deck pretty exclusively, and I definitely can say I think personally that Poe is more or less the problem for the deck. Today, especially when I was playing games, a lot of people were focusing on Ray, and if they did kill her, it actually wasn't the end of the world, because I actually had a game where my Ray got eaten turn 2, but I was able to kill my opponent's Ray. So it was Han versus Poe, and my opponent's Han was loaded up. He had a holdout blaster from Ray, he had the DH-17, and he had a heavy blaster DL-44, which then he later overwrote the baby blaster for a jetpack. So point is, my Poe had nothing on him. His Han had full suite of guns, and he wasn't actually able to roll enough damage to kill me faster than I could roll to kill him, because I was able to get into my 2 damage sides, my 3 damage sides, and if need be, I would just claim the battlefield, flip a special, and throw a black 1 in his face. I was able to hit him for 4 damage with a Mind Probe. I mean, Poe is just damage on a stick, where Han and guns, they have damage, but they also have a lot of other sides. And so he was pitching cards to reroll. I was able to mitigate a very little bit with deflect. But the point is, if Poe dies, in fact, one of the games I lost, the only game I lost was where Poe was killed first. And Rey was loaded up with a holdout blaster. She had a baby blaster, and she didn't really do anything. She dealt maybe 1 or 2 damage per turn. But leaving Poe alive is so detrimental, because you can action shenanigan with Rey all you want, but she's just going to turn her sides into discard resources and a little bit of damage, compared to Poe being able to output 6 to potentially 8 damage depending on the cards you have in hand and if you can get those specials. So I definitely would say, if you're facing against Poe and Rey, I would focus on Poe, because once he's out, Rey isn't all that scary. You know, we've said it before a million times, everyone thinks Rey's the problem because of the action shenanigans. In this deck, I don't actually think that's the case, because she doesn't do the damage. She's just the utility piece to let Poe do all the damage, because most of the damage is coming from his 2s, his 3s, and his specials. So if there's a way to mitigate that with removal, if you're able to just, eat his dice away or turn him off, Rey is not going to hurt really bad. Even if she gets a god roll, you're looking at maybe 5-6 damage tops, depending on what she's got on her, but that's not the end of the world. So definitely keep your eye on this deck, and do know, I think the biggest thing people underestimate is how fast this deck can roll and resolve their die faces. Even if they're bad die faces, that is not a measure to look at that die face and go, okay, cool, I'm not going to take damage. Poe's dice just do damage all day long, even if they're on blank. So be very careful about what you're looking at. And if you have the option to remove Poe's dice, please definitely make sure you do that, because Rey, once again, is not doing a whole lot of damage most of the time.
Yeah, Rey's here more or less for access to blue and the occasional 2-cost hit and run, where you play the holdout blaster on her, trigger ability, get the ambush, and be able to roll out Poe and resolve his special without them being able to have a chance to get rid of the special sides from Poe. Again, kill Poe and make Rey beat you. If you're going up just against Rey at that point, if you can fight their resources in any way, make them overwrite stuff to be able to get these expensive upgrades out there, then you shouldn't have a problem. I mean, if you can get rid of Poe quickly without losing too much, then you're probably going to be winning that game anyway.
All right, so let's move along to the top 2 decks that were in Stele Open. The first one is no stranger to this show. It is the Django Ibala Trooper deck, and, Jay's best friend for the longest time. So we've talked about it before, but let's discuss it again in depth. This deck is very fast. It's very dangerous, and there's a lot of things you have to consider, even if you're playing with it or playing against it. So let's just right off the bat talk about the basic deck construction. What is this deck running, and what is it supposed to be doing?
This deck heavily evolved into realizing that some of its staples are, it uses 3 yellow die from Django and Ibala, which allows you to use the ever-present Fight Dirty on top of cards like Jetpack, on top of cards like On the Hunt.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically damage dice and dice mitigation on the event side, with a little bit of reach thrown in there and backup muscle, and like Jay said, Fight Dirty and arm to the teeth. So its goal is to get at least 1 extra trigger off of Bala, and with the reach cards that we talked about, it's very easy to do. Very easy to do when you don't think it's possible. There's many times that you'll claim thinking that their turn is over. They have blanks on Bala or whatever, and they're able to get a kill off, reactivate Bala, sometimes put a big hurt or kill another character on top of it. The Stormtroopers kind of there for a little bit of extra damage and to enable the cannon fodders and the best defenses and things like that. Some people will play tactical masteries in this deck in order to get a little bit extra speed in it. Some people don't. Personally, I took the tactical masteries out and played unpredictables instead, just to help when Django isn't cooperating, and also a little bit extra mitigation sometimes. Your different choices in the battlefield. Some lists are running Rebel War Rooms, some lists are running Mustafar. Again, it's just kind of taste flavor. I run Mustafar just for help against 2-character lists, because that's where the deck sometimes can struggle in, especially against fast damage decks like Vader Raider.
another thing too is being able to determine what cards are safe on discarding, because there are a lot of your damage options that you want to hang on to as much as possible. So you have to be careful what you use to reroll. If the reroll is going to generate enough lead or damage that card isn't going to bring or help you with later. The deck has a high amount of decision making that can, without you realizing, push the reach of the deck further and further away that you might not be able to kill on turn 3 or 4 like you tend to be hoping. So it's one of the things that I like about the deck is that it can be very explosive, it can be very tactical, and it can create scenarios where, you know, you have a loaded up yellow character that you have like that sweet arm to the teeth primed and ready, or, you know, you play your backup muscles and using Mustafar shields mean nothing. So yeah, it's just a deck that like can create these very systemically powerful moments, but it does run into trouble. Bala dying, you lose 2 of those yellow dice or more, and that causes a lot of issues. If the trooper doesn't mitigate enough damage, it's hard to rely on him. It's susceptible to disarms, which really hurts its dice potential, and obviously removal in general, taking out your natural sides. Bala's plus side isn't quite as good. Django throwing melees or having to deal with the trooper's pay side all can cause the deck to chug. So some people like myself try to add more money gain options to smooth out the money curve. Others, like Rick, try to rely on cards like Unpredictable. It's just kind of finding your own rhythm and flow, and you really need turns like, specifically turn 1. There are games where Bala will be evaporated by a good Vader roll or a good, you know, whatever else. So mulligan options are also incredibly important to figure out, to see, like, do I need to be more defensive? Do I need to be more offensive? All these things really factor this deck, and you know, I speak really highly of it because it's the deck I have the most experience with. I do think under the right circumstances, disbarring, you know, God rules, this deck does have what it takes to meet all comers, but it's also a deck that kind of collapses like a house of cards quickly when things aren't in its favor. So
when we look at these decks, we've got Veers and Balatik and Night Sister, and it's all about consistency. It's all about running really good stuff. When you look at Poe and Ray, it's explosive damage. You're taking turns where, you know, it's not consistent, but you can just blow someone out with like 5, 8, 10 damage in a turn. Bala, Django Trooper, what do you think this deck is doing? Because I know you talked before lots, Jay, about this sideways damage where you turn things that aren't damage into damage. So what would you say this deck is doing in comparison to, you know, consistent deck and explosive deck? What is this kind of deck?
One thing I've learned over time is this deck isn't necessarily what I would call consistent, because you have to play almost like little shell games trying to move around and make other targets threatening. Like, I often try to load up Django, so hopefully he draws some ire in matchups where I'm trying to keep Bala alive. Other times, sometimes I try to bring all the hate to Bala, but use, you know, predominantly redeploys, so you can get those over to Django or Trooper. And again, like, trying to steal extra turns and keep your characters alive with things like the best defense can sometimes save you from, you know, those horrific god rolls and things like that. This deck, if played well, again, like, it creates those, you know, those like cages where you have the arm to the teeth in your hand. If you act first, you're safe to just roll out and then immediately fight dirty and then immediately arm to the teeth for, like, that's usually a 6 damage combo. And you can create traps where just being able to claim or use your backup muscles to finish off targets is all you're going to need to apply pressure whether or not you roll. And I think one of the strengths is, if played correctly, it doesn't matter what you roll necessarily. Something I learned was, you know, in a lot of ways this deck early on can afford to take money, afford to take shields, and set itself up for later and not worry as much for early damage. It depends on what you're up against. It depends on if that damage will get a quick kill. I mean, there's a lot of factors to it, but burning cards for rerolls can be very harmful to this deck, but at the same time, always making sure that you can get to the cards that you need to close the game is also important. So it's a delicate balance. Consistency isn't necessarily what I would describe this deck as, because it's almost more of a toolbox and that kind of nature of a deck. And without things like, there's no tutors in this game. You just sort of have to know where your cards are, what to expect, and what your contingency plans are.
Yeah, this, like Jay was saying, there's times with this deck where I've rolled through my opponent not losing a single character, just had everything that I would need to win, and there's some times where I don't draw a upgrade until turn 3, but sometimes you're still able to come back off of that, off of the reach cards. But yeah, it's the thing I like best about this deck that, near the end of the game, no character is safe at 4 health, right? As long as you got 3 upgrades on and a backup muscle out there, they're pretty much dead, and they know it, and they gotta play around that sort of stuff. You start the round, you back up, or you arm to the teeth for 3 damage. There's nothing they can really do about it at that point if you have the arm or the backup muscle sitting on the table. They can't get shields, they can't interact with the backup muscle at all. They just know that they're done. Sometimes, especially with Mustafar, I'll claim early just to get that extra damage on the one character left over, knowing that I got 4 coming the next round no matter what. It's a good deck. It's a consistent deck. It's not winning these tournaments like you would think it would, though. This one made the top 2 from the people that I know that were at Stele at the time. It did have a little bit of rough rolls in the beginning and kind of got destroyed by the Han Ray pretty quickly. But, it's you will see this deck at Worlds, and you will have to know how to play against it.
Oh yeah, you will definitely see this deck at Worlds. People in a lot of metas are running it. One big tip I definitely want to give about this deck, and something people make mistakes on, is if you're looking at your opponent's board and they have 0 resources or even 1, a lot of people look at that and think, there's not a lot of damage coming out if your opponent rolls very poorly, and that's not the case. This deck is really good at dealing sideways damage, like Jay has said, and so if you're looking at a bunch of blanks or a bunch of damage sides, or they have to pay money for it but they can't, or if you're looking at maybe a bunch of resources and things, you have to consider that Fight Dirty exists, and you have to consider that Arm to the Teeth exists, and they can do damage even without showing damage. So sometimes it is worth your removal card to keep your character alive in case they happen to have the one they have 1 resource and they've got that combo where they throw all the yellow dice in your face, and then they throw all their yellow upgrades into your face, and they just pop you for a lot of damage you weren't expecting. Don't think that an empty board of resources is no damage. So definitely keep an eye out for that, and make wise considerations when using your removal options, because this deck is always able to deal damage in some fashion, even if it's not showing it. Do be aware. Let's move on to the final deck that took the whole thing. This is a deck we've seen before. It won the TTS tournament, and this is Han Ray. Second time Han Ray has taken a fairly large event. So let's talk about this deck. We know it's 2 Han, it's 2 Ray. You're doing all kinds of ambush actions to get Han shields. Use Ray's action economy, not much different from Poe. You're not using the special shenanigans to throw things in people's faces, but you are dealing a lot of range damage. You're running Starship Graveyard to reanimate those cards that you need, primarily Second Chance. Let's talk about the deck and what we think about it.
So I haven't really been playing too much with Han Ray since Awakenings first came out. It's one of the decks that I started off with. I wrote a little bit about it in the beginning and then just kind of dismissed it as being kind of inconsistent, mainly because of Ray's sides. She is only there for her ability in this matchup. Every once in a while she'll roll well and do some damage, but Han in conjunction with all the extra actions that you can get out of this deck is where it really shines. This deck, we don't have the list for the winning list, but it's not going to be really anything too surprising out of it. You can expect the Holdout Blasters, the Jakku Starship Graveyard is your real key stuff, and then other ambush like the heavy blaster pistols, Infamous, which helps to make some of the other upgrades also trigger Ray as well. With Infamous, you can even use Hunker Down as a way to trigger Ray, so just look out for that. If your opponent has Infamous on the board, they're going to get extra actions pretty much every turn from that point on. Really, the way that I kind of picked up this deck recently is just testing the meta, or in our gauntlet, I played a lot of this testing specific decks to see how well it'll do against, because you know that this will come in as a pretty heavy represented deck in the meta for Worlds, and I can't believe that I underestimated the power of this deck. If it rolls well, there's almost nothing you can do to stop it, but luckily Ray just keeps it just out of consistency to where it's basically an unstoppable force, right? The way that I like to beat it is to just focus on Han, get him out of there and make Ray beat you. A lot of people think that getting rid of the action economy for Ray is the better way to go, but at that point you have to deal with second chance recurring from the Starship Graveyard over and over again, and being able to put those last points of damage onto Han while he's rolling 2 and 3 damage every turn. So that's really where you kind of need to test and see which way your deck can handle it better. If you have the ability to do 6 points of damage in one turn, you can probably leave Han till the end, but if not, you got to get rid of Han as soon as you can.
Yeah, I gotta say that there are a lot of times where we were asked, where do we really feel like this deck is, and a lot of times, I'll admit, I said that this deck always felt like tier 2, and yet it keeps, crawling its way to the top of these events. And although I've never felt the deck was bad, it was always remarking upon its consistency. But obviously, if if you're used to it, if you know what to play towards, it's definitely a deck that rewards experience. I would not recommend this deck if you are, looking into maybe I'll play that for Worlds. If you don't have a lot of experience with this deck, it's probably going to crumble in your hands, unless you're, a good roller. But, in a way, I can't say I'm surprised. I keep seeing it because it does have the tools to cause tricky scenarios, being able to recur. The second chance does so much for the deck. Ray allowing you to do sneaky snipe plays, and again, it has all the little tricks it needs to, cheat small advantages, or just, God, sometimes it's hard to get that 6 damage, and when you can't get that 6 damage, Han just kind of laughs at you, even if he keeps rolling blanks trying to shoot you back. But yeah, it's, I'll come around and say, maybe I misjudged it. I still feel like the consistency issues are there, but experience can pull through that. And it does afford itself, when played well, extra turns, which allows you to, of course, make the best out of all that sort of stuff. So yeah, sometimes Han just will never go down.
Yes, I do agree. It is interesting because we didn't actually think this was a super crazy, incredible deck, and yet it is doing very well in the meta. I will say a couple things. I have faced against this many times, and even today I played against a Han Ray, and if it's not, there is a consistency issue. I can totally agree. We played in the tournament and I beat it, and then I played with a guy again and I beat it a second time, and both were pretty handy. I will say he never got out his second chances. I did win the roll both times to get my battlefield, because there's no way I'm letting him play Starship Graveyard, and my opponent had problems finding his holdout blasters. But with that being said, it is a beatable deck. There's a lot of things. So first of all, I'll discuss what the deck is doing. It is not different from Poe and Ray in the fact that you're loading up Ray to get action economy, then you're going to roll out your dudes and dudettes, and you're going to deal your damage as fast as possible. So since you don't have access to hit and run, so you can roll everybody and roll everybody, a lot of times I saw my opponents playing either a scavenge. So what they would do is they would play turn 1 a Jedi Robes for 2, and then they would overwrite with a holdout blaster, and then they would play another holdout blaster, so they have 3 actions now. Then they would scavenge, and they didn't care what they scavenged because they'd pull a holdout blaster and overwrite the holdout blaster again. So now they're sitting on 4 actions, so they would roll out everyone and then resolve everyone, and hopefully do a lot of damage before you can do anything about it. Now, if your opponent rolls poorly, which I got lucky and my opponent didn't roll any damage, then they're kind of stuck because now they've spent all of these resources and all of this economy and they're sitting on nothing. Another thing I definitely can say that this deck is doing much better than Ray is consistent damage. And I'm not entirely sure how it works, because you would think, Poe flips into Poe special and throws things, but that relies heavily on the cards in your hand. And there were turns where I would have nothing to throw, even though I was in a prime position with 2 Poe specials. And I think where the Han Rey deck surpasses Poe and Rey is that once you get those guns out onto the field, you're going to be rolling damage over and over and over and over. And the more dice you roll, the higher probability of rolling damage, which means more damage over a longer period of time. Where Poe and Rey is just get some specials, throw stuff in your face, and that's it. You're going to be rolling 5, 6, 7 dice when you've got Rey and Han on the field, and that adds up over a longer period of time where you've got a higher chance to hit the numbers you want, and you can pop out people really fast. Another big thing about this deck, and what people really underestimate, is the sustainability. We've seen a lot of people start to slide in Street Informants, so that's a really funky card that we didn't think about for a long time, and now, it's this 0-drop support, and it's an ambush. So when you exhaust the support, you get to look at your opponent's hand. And as we've said before, in any card game, knowing what your opponent has in their hand is extremely useful. Knowing that your opponent has an Intimidate to eat all your shields. Oh, okay, well then you just don't resolve the shields to put on your characters if you're at like 2 per character, because you don't want to lose shields when your opponent's going to blow them out anyways. If your opponent's running a lot of removal, then you just have to assume they're going to hit you hard that turn, but you also know that they don't have a lot of equipment, so they're not going to have a lot of dice to roll. Just having that hand knowledge is really beneficial, even though you may not have a lot of removal yourself. It's such an aggressive deck that having all those shields is great, having access to second chance is great, and knowing what your opponent can and cannot do allows you to make educated decisions with how you roll and resolve your dice. So it is a powerful deck, but boy, I'll tell you what, the poor guy who played today, I think he won 1 game and he lost everything, and he was just saying, it's feast or famine. Even the guy who won the tournament today was saying, sometimes Han just doesn't want to play games. He just wants to go take a nap. And it is true. It does have consistency issues, but if you know how to play around them, this deck can be extremely brutal with how it plays and how it deals with bad situations.
It's true. All of it.
One thing I do want to say that I found very interesting, and you can take this or leave this, but rolling disrupts early in the game actually was very beneficial against playing Han Rey. One of the games I rolled with Poe, and so I played out a hit and run, and I rolled double disrupt, and so I decided to resolve it because I had a pretty good inclination my opponent had a holdout blaster in his hand, and he actually did. Once the game was over, I asked, did you have the blaster? And he was like, I actually had 2 and the scavenge, and he was going to try and do a 4-action turn on me and attempt to blow out Rey or Poe if he got lucky. And so just being able to eat away the resources early game does put Han and Rey in a bad situation, because they're hoping to get ambush actions off. They want to get the holdout blaster onto Rey for those 2 actions. They want to play Infamous so they can use that to make all of their cards have ambush and throw things on Rey. And if you can eat their economy really early, it's almost as good as damage. I'm not going to say it is the same, but the fact that you're really, really hurting their economy does put the deck in a really bad situation, because it is pretty stripped for cash early game. Once they've got stuff on the field, the overwrite cost is usually free or 1, because most of their characters have 2 cost upgrades. But if you can nullify that resource and that economy early game, that hurts. Also, I did have a couple times where my Rey rolled double discard, and that really hurt my opponent because I was able to get a holdout blaster, a heavy blaster, and they were just like, hey, that's like, those are the pieces of the pie that they need to win the game. And if you can remove their economy or their options, that does help you in the long run, because now you can sustain and you don't have to be afraid of getting hit with double holdout blasters, a holdout blaster and heavy blaster, and where all their damage is coming from is their guns. If you can make them not pay for them or not play them, you're in a great place. All right, so as we're coming up to Worlds, we're just a couple weeks away. Let's talk about some really good playing tips for people who are listening. We've got a 3-day event, Thursday, Friday, Saturday for Destiny. It's not going to be just a simple couple hours at a tournament shop. what are some tips you can definitely give for the players who are going to be coming out that might help them in the long run?
So before you even hit the plane ride, you really want to start testing right now. These 4 decks should definitely be in your gauntlet. It won the latest large tournament, really the biggest tournament, in-person tournament that Destiny has had. So people are going to look for these decks. They're going to find them. They're going to build them. They're going to play them in Worlds. And just an aside, EPO Ray is very prevalent in the Minnesota area. If you look at any tournaments that come out of there, there's a couple of them in there, and they usually place pretty high. So, Worlds is in Minnesota. There will be a lot of people that go there because they don't have to pay for plane tickets and hotels. So there is a heavy representation of the Minnesota meta at Worlds every year. Ray will likely be there in pretty significant numbers. The Evirs being the newest deck that's kind of hit the scene. People will pick it up and want to play it. And of course you got Han Ray and Ebola Django Trooper that have been pretty heavily represented since the start. So these 4 decks are going to really need to make up some portion of your testing and your gauntlet for when you're trying to figure out what you want to play and how to beat these, what you're going to be playing against.
I've mentioned these tips a lot, but I'll repeat them again. As always, definitely test against the decks you're afraid of until you're not afraid of them anymore. Test using the unfavorable battlefield. Make sure you know what you plan on doing. If you're playing against Hanrei and they have Starship Graveyard, does that change your battle plan? Does that change how you want to approach it? Make sure to play. Sometimes don't mulligan if your hand's bad and just try to push through and be like, all right, this is my world's hand. This is what I'm left with. Imagine that was your mulligan. What are you going to do? And then sort of a lot of side tips that you really want to take seriously that you might not think about. Worlds is very psychological, especially if you haven't been to Worlds before or you haven't been in tournaments that large. You really have to take seriously the amount of sleep you get, that you've eaten. Any kinds of distractions will really pitch apart at your game, even subconsciously. And again, not being on tilt when you draw a bad hand or you get bad rerolls. Every little thing will add up and take attacks on you. You're going to be playing long periods of time. These tournaments do not tend to go very quickly, so fatigue does set in. And definitely it's difficult, but if you don't have a strong first round and you're down a game, try not to let that get to you. Always just imagine every game's important and every game's going to push you forward. And the more you focus on, the more you freak out that you might get knocked out. That might be all it took. You weren't paying attention. You'll tend to make more mistakes. All these kinds of things really, really do add up. And people who are very good at games and do these tournament circuits, they know how to focus on what's important. They only exist in the game proper. They don't get rattled by bad rolls. They don't get rattled by bad hands. They don't get rattled when they don't have initiative. And that type of confidence and that type of experience matters just as much as what cards are in your deck. So don't play anything too weird you're not familiar with. If you really aren't sure that you made all the right decisions, try during your testing sessions to get friends to help you and watch. And then if you're strictly in test mode, feel free to be does this seem like the right play, based on the information of things try to be familiar with what's in their discard pile. Do remember, this is something we even talked about today earlier, is make sure, don't worry about deflect if their blue character's dead. Don't worry about electroshock if their yellow character's dead. And make sure your opponent, accidentally or otherwise, isn't playing those cards when those aren't legal. Be up to snuff and prepared to know, what these conditional cards are. And, should you expect them? Are you safe now? If you haven't seen either of those electroshocks early, maybe you knock out their yellow character and that'll make, 2 cards in their deck possibly become dead draws. Like, stuff like that adds up, and your opponent's thinking about it. So all these things, add together, and just make sure that you're aware, that you're ready, that you're rested, and, just don't focus on things that are going bad. Rich says constantly, it is what it is. This is your moment. Just don't let it get to you. The ever-present quote of "Fear is the mind killer."
My tips are very similar to Jay's. My biggest one is, if you haven't gone to one of these tournaments, you're talking about pretty much an entire day of playing card games, and you would think, oh man, that's awesome, I get to play card games all day. Yeah, it is awesome. It does eat up a lot of mental energy because you're playing games over and over and over and over. And my 2 big tips for anyone: drink a lot of water during your breaks, or if you can, bring a bottled water with you and stay hydrated. Sometimes you're in a big room and you get kind of sweaty and you're a little nervous, whatever. Keep hydrated. Also bring snacks. You're playing a lot of times, you get hungry, or your blood sugar might drop a little bit and you're just kind of not feeling great. Bring some snacks that you like. Bring some snacks that will not necessarily fill you up, but they'll keep you running for the day. But you do get a lunch break, and traditionally between games you might get like 5-10 minute break. Use the restroom, move to your next table. Use that to your advantage. Eat a snack, drink some water, stretch if you need to. You're going to be sitting most of the day. Like Jay was saying, it is a very psychological game, and if you make a mistake, you made the mistake. Don't beat yourself up, but 100% of the time, do not be afraid to ask to see the card. I cannot stress how many times people make mistakes in these games, especially the longer you play, the tireder you are, and people make honest mistakes. People will play an electroshock when they don't have a yellow character to spot. They'll play the tactical mastery when their red character is dead. If you're not sure about something, it's not a bad thing to say, hey, I want to read the card real quick and verify if you think something is off. Or if someone just has a misplay, you can tell them, you can't play that. You don't have a character to spot. That's totally fine. You don't have to feel like someone can just do whatever they want. It is your responsibility to keep an eye on the game as much as it is your opponent's responsibility to make sure everyone is playing fairly. One big tip I do like to recommend before going into these events: do read the tournament rules. There's a page on the FFG website. I'm not saying people are going to cheat or do anything weird, but it is nice to know the rules in case you come up against some kind of situation and you definitely know what needs to be done, instead of not knowing what's going on and how things are going to be going down. Big thing I want people to be aware of is there's a lot of third-party tokens out on the market, and there might be some issues with some third-party tokens, and you have the right to ask the marshal to make a call on questionable third-party tokens. It's in the tournament regulations. You can look it up on page 4, but don't feel uncomfortable with any specific situation in the game. Know the rules. Feel free to ask questions. It's totally fine. And most of all, don't beat yourself up. Everyone makes mistakes. If you just realize later, oh man, I should have done this instead of that, use that in your next game moving forward. Use that as an advantage for yourself so that you can make the best plays possible as you go through a long day. And my last tip is definitely, if you have a bad hand or you're not looking at a great hand, make your opponent play as hard as they can. Make your opponent think you have the best hand humanly possible, because there's a lot of times where you're sitting on a bad hand, and I've seen people do this in big tournaments, and they'll say, man, I've just got nothing. And that tells me, as the opponent, unless they're lying, I'm going to be able to do most of the things I want to do without much fear of retaliation. But if you keep playing and you keep smiling and you keep that poker face and you just, shuffle with that hand and you make him think, man, this guy's got removal, he's got the money, make your opponent play. Make your opponent make the hard decisions. Like I said earlier, I rolled out double post special and I had nothing in my hand to throw at them. And the opponent was like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, are you ready for a double mind probe? And he was like, no. And he threw some removal at me. And he didn't know I didn't have a mind probe. And it was perfect because I was able to eat resources, cards, and removal out of his hand just by bluffing. So never ever give your opponent knowledge of bad hands or you're just not able to make it happen. Always make them think you've got control of the game because that'll help you in the long run, and it won't let your opponent know that they can just kind of play freely, which is really bad.
And one last tip from me is that, you know, this is the highest level of competition for FFG's games, but in the end, most of the people are there to have fun, and you should be there too. Understand that only one person is going to win this tournament. Only one person can be the world champion for 2017. It may be you, but have a backup plan if you don't make day 2. Because I'm flying in on a Wednesday night. I'm playing in one Destiny flight on Thursday. I hope to be making the top 16, but I might not, right? So I need to, I'm prepared that if I don't make day 2, I got other things to do until my flight leaves on Sunday morning. You know, hang out with friends. It's a great place to get to see people that you'll see probably once a year, maybe twice if you go to Gen Con. You know, you'll see people from, you know, in Europe and farther out there to play, you know, just meet people, have fun, be a good person, and then play the best Destiny you possibly can, and hopefully you can be the world champion.
Yeah, we're really excited to see who's going to take it. Obviously, you know, Rick, we want you to win, but we are really excited to come and hang out. All 3 of us are going to be at Worlds. We've got our tickets, we've got our hotel, we've made it happen, and we are going to be there. So if you don't make it to day 2, come find us. We will play games with you. I'll play games with you. I can't speak for Jay, but we are more than willing to hang out. We're more than willing to talk about Destiny. FFG's got board games. I know, right? So I'm going to try and get a Cosmic Encounter game going with Chris Bates. He's interested in playing, and maybe Rick and Jay. But
I'll be playing in day 2. So.
Oh, okay, all right. Using the Force to determine the future seems very unfair, sir. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, Lord Kyle will be pleased. So yeah, on Friday, we are actually going to be hosting a Knights of Ren happy hour. Chris Bates is hooking us up with all of the details, so we'll be announcing more about that soon. But man, if you're in the area and you're not playing Worlds, come join us. It's for open to anyone and everyone. There'll be food. It's a bar. So, but I mean, like, we're just going to have fun, talk about Destiny, play games, hang out, have a good time. So everyone who's listening, you're totally invited to come. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of side events and other things you can do if you don't make it to day 2. So, you know, we're going to be hanging out and having a lot of fun. So we are so excited for going to Worlds, and we really, really want to say a big thank you to all of our Patreons, because you guys and girls have helped us to get 2 Worlds in this year. And man, we are just so excited to meet so many people, you know, get some drinks, play some games, hang out, and just talk and meet some of these people we've only met in a digital landscape. So thank you. So a couple of things to wrap up before we get out of here for housekeeping. Star Wars Celebration is in Orlando, and it's happening in a couple of days. And Sugi, that's me, I am going to be there, and I would love to meet anyone and everyone who's going to be there. I will be at the Destiny tables. I'm going to do my best to make it to the FFG panel that they're having, and I'm going to be hanging out with anyone and everyone who wants to play some games and goof off and just kind of talk about Destiny. So let us know on Facebook if you're going to be there, and we'll figure out some kind of meetup. And yeah, it's going to be great. If you're not coming, we are going to be covering everything about Celebration I possibly can, so keep an eye on our social media stuff. We're going to have some things that are not Destiny related, just so you know. There's going to be episode 8 stuff, Rebel stuff, all kinds of things related to Destiny, and who knows, maybe some special celebrity interviews. We'll see what happens. But just so you know, that is coming up this week. We also want to say a big thank you to everyone who voted for us in the Star Wars Podcast Awards. We have won the best Star Wars gaming podcast for 2016-2017. So thank you everyone who nominated us and everyone who voted. We really appreciate it, and we couldn't be more happy that we were able to clinch that award. All right, so this is the end of the show. We are so excited for all the events coming up. Once again, big thank you to everyone who's participated, listened, joined us on Patreon, talked to us on Discord, and met us in real life. We just love this community and this game so much. So we are thankful for you guys listening. We will see you guys next week, and a big shout out to all the people who played in Stele Open. Congratulations to the winners. We hope to see some of you all at Worlds, and thank you for listening, and may the Force be with you.